Mr. Tremie.
On behalf of Article 39, together with Mary Rachel McCabe, the focus of submissions and any questions will be on the most vulnerable children and young people in society. Those in care, relying on the state for parenting and protection, and those living in state and privately run institutions. Children in detention, whether through the mental health or criminal justice systems, or in state care, are not one homogenous group, but there are factors they routinely share. Abuse or threat of abuse from carers, separation from parents and other family, including siblings, the uncertainty and instability of being parented by a local authority with ever-changing homes, carers and professionals, often sent far from home, challenges to identity and self-worth. For children in prison, a disproportionately high number of them were looked after prior to incarceration. Their vulnerability is all too obvious. As counsel to the inquiry highlighted, prior to the pandemic, nearly a third of UK children were living in relative poverty, a quarter were in absolute poverty, and half of local authority children's services in England were judged by Ofsted to be less than good. The picture for a typical child in need was pretty bleak. That was the reality for the especially vulnerable children whom Article 39 serves. It's all the more important, therefore, that these children should be regarded, as the Scottish Children's Commissioner says, as rights holders, rather than passive objects of education, care, or charity. As the pandemic hit, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child called on governments to protect children whose vulnerability would be further increased, including children deprived of their liberty or confined, and children living in institutions. We submit that the government's core error in response to the pandemic was failing to consider the impact of policies on children, failing to listen to, consult or act upon the advice of professionals working with children, or to hear from children themselves on the impact of policy decisions. The Scottish Children's Commissioner quotes one of their young advisors in July 2020. Life-changing decisions being made during coronavirus have felt like playing a game. Every time it should be our turn, someone skips over us and we end up being left behind and forgotten. Article 39 continues to regret that this inquiry will not hear directly from children, but respectfully suggests that this highlights the imperative to consider carefully evidence from the Children's Commissioners and other children's rights organisations. The introduction of the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations in April 2020 is a good example of government failings. We have a carefully crafted statutory scheme for children in care, and importantly, for those first coming into care, often frightened, always extremely vulnerable. Laws and established practices in place to ensure their rights and well-being. The amendment regulations made changes to 10 statutory instruments, including reducing and removing legal duties relating to social worker visits, reviews of children's welfare, and checks on children's homes. These unquestionably substantial and wide-ranging changes were described at the time by the DfE to the Children's Commissioner for England as minor burdens. Both the High Court and the Court of Appeal rejected this characterisation of the changes, the latter describing them as having the potential to have a significant impact on children in care. The Court of Appeal also found that there had been a selective, one-sided consultation and that the then Education Secretary, Sir Gavin Williamson's failure to consult with the Children's Commissioner and children's rights organisations was unlawful. It remains wholly unclear today why the government found time to consult with select others, but not the Children's Commissioner for England. What does this unexplained failure to consult with a statutory body charged with promoting and protecting the rights of children, in particular those living away from home, say about the status and importance of children's rights in policy making at the time? What does it say about the culture within government to thoroughly mischaracterise the nature of the changes to children's law? The profound errors behind the introduction of the amendment regulations yield the obvious submission that they could have been avoided had there been incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and a statutory obligation to consult with the Children's Commissioner. But there are other examples of how things went very wrong for vulnerable children during the pandemic, most obviously children in prison. Changes to an already impoverished and harmful regime were subject to no child rights impact assessments or consultation with the Children's Commissioner for England. Children in young offender institutions and secure training centres had severely restricted time out of their cells. We say cells, not rooms, with some receiving only an hour and a half a day and at weekends only 45 minutes. These changes meant that in breach of the Mandela rules, children were routinely subject to solitary confinement for prolonged periods with inevitable, debilitating consequences on their mental and physical health. Whilst vulnerable children in the community were encouraged to go to school, opportunities for learning, social interaction, and for physical exercise, children in prison had those significantly curtailed. A worksheet pushed under a cell door does not fulfil a child's right to education. Article 39 will seek to draw attention to the evidence that children living in secure children's homes received much better protection, due surely to the child-focused approach. The starting point to avoid such mistakes in the future, in any future pandemic or national emergency, must be to recognise that children are individuals with clearly defined rights and entitlements which carry the force of law. That's also why Article 39, together with other core participants, invites the inquiry to approach this module and its conclusions through the prism of children's rights and the UNCRC. Article 39 will submit that throughout the pandemic there was no dedicated plan within government on how to protect the rights and interests of children generally and vulnerable children and young people in particular. And this failure was due to the absence of a children's rights strategy, including incorporation of the UNCRC into domestic law, the absence of a statutory duty on government to consult with respective children's commissioners, and the absence of a cabinet minister for children with a children's rights portfolio, one of ICSA's closing recommendations in October 22. Article 39 respectfully suggests that in the event of another pandemic, the key to ensuring that children's rights are respected and their well-being safeguarded is in two core recommendations. Firstly, that the UNCRC is incorporated into domestic law in the same way that the Human Rights Act gives effect to certain provisions of the European Convention of Human Rights. Nobody sensibly suggested a suspension of the Human Rights Act during the pandemic. Indeed, it's a strong pointer towards a rights-based approach that in times of national emergency, governments need to have robust structures, robust guidelines in place to ensure decisions afford appropriate weight to the rights of all citizens, including children. In other words, it is precisely when government is under pressure to make quick decisions that effective tools and guidance are necessary, and incorporation of the UNCRC provides those tools. Secondly, Article 39 respectfully suggests that there should be a statutory duty to consult with and give due weight to the advice of the Children's Commissioners. These statutory bodies possess not just theoretical understanding of children's rights, but are required by law to be directly connected to the lived experience of children with critical channels for eliciting the perspectives of children and young people, both in ordinary times and in emergencies. The Children's Commissioner for England is required by law to use the UNCRC as her basis for determining children's rights. Yet, without incorporation into law, this duty lacks a proper foundation. If we do not have these structures and systems to uphold rights, to elicit, understand, and act upon the views, perspectives, and feelings of children, then that is when things go wrong. And if they go wrong for vulnerable children, the consequences can be disastrous. The amendment regulations and the treatment of children in prison provide two standout examples of how things were prone to and did go wrong, and how the two recommendations would have prevented these errors. In the event of a future pandemic, it will be essential for all children, but most particularly vulnerable children, in care or custody, that decisions affecting them are taken according to a rights-based approach. Each Children's Commissioner of each of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom identifies failures by their respective governments to heed children's rights. Article 39 submits that this follows from each nation's failure during the pandemic to have fully incorporated the UNCRC or to have a statutory obligation to consult with their Children's Commissioner. And so we endorse the recommendations made this morning on behalf of the CROs. Scotland directly incorporated the UNCRC into domestic law in 2024. It is surely intolerable that only children in one part of the United Kingdom have this protection in the event of a future pandemic or national emergency. There should be consistency of rights protection. My lady, I referred earlier to the Mandela Rules. When launching his Children's Fund 30 years ago, Nelson Mandela said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children." What a telling observation when one looks, as this inquiry will, into how, during the pandemic, our society treated its most vulnerable children. Lady, we're very grateful for the opportunity to address you this morning, and those are our opening submissions.
Thank you very much indeed. Very helpful. Ms. King.
My Lady, Coram remains grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the work of the inquiry. Coram has provided a comprehensive response to the request for a Rule 9 statement for this module, and Dr. Carol Hobden, CBE, Chief Executive Officer of the Coram Group of Charities, will be appearing to give evidence at the inquiry tomorrow morning. I appear together with Ms. Logan Green and instructed by Jenna and Block, some of whose team attend today. As the inquiry knows, Coram is the UK's oldest children's charity, working as the Coram Group of specialist organisations. It considers that it holds a unique perspective on how the lives of children were affected by the COVID pandemic. The Coram Group considers that because of its constituent parts and underpinning ethos, it occupies a unique role amongst the core participants in being able to provide a particularly broad perspective on the impact that the pandemic had on children and young people. This is due to the breadth and diversity of the work that it conducts across different sectors. Coram sees the inquiry as an opportunity to explore the legacy of the pandemic and address some of the shortcomings of the governmental response. Coram considers that engagement with third sector organisations is critical. The various organisations which make up the Coram Group are ready to play an active and ongoing role in future planning. Coram considers itself able to bridge the wide chasm between statutory and charitable organisations. It hopes that the government will build on the foundations already laid and ensure that future contingency planning involves the members of the Coram Group. Coram has a wide understanding of the complexities and difficulties that children and young people face during the pandemic. It seeks to ensure, through its participation in this inquiry, that children's voices and perspectives are heard both now in reflecting upon the response to the pandemic and in the future in planning pandemic responses. It would be an opportunity missed if in curating a response to another future pandemic, the interests of children were consigned to the margins or left as an afterthought, as so often seemed to be the case in respect of COVID-19, as Coram and others have noted. These oral submissions are to be considered in conjunction with Coram's opening written submissions and the evidence it has provided to the inquiry. On the basis of its own research and experiences during the pandemic, and having considered the evidence provided to the inquiry, Coram has come to the view that if and when the next pandemic strikes, there is a need to put children at the heart of decision-making and implementation. To that end, as a preemptive step, Coram supports its colleagues in Article 39 and the CRO Group's call for incorporation of the UNCRC across the UK. However, incorporation without good implementation is hollow, and the evidence before the inquiry shows the importance of putting in place good practice and risk planning now, so that children's needs will be considered and protected in future crises. Coram proposes that a dedicated Cabinet Minister for Children be introduced. Coram believes that this would assist in ensuring resources are properly allocated to future planning. A statutory child impact assessment obligation as part of crisis planning, particularly in relation to predictive planning, will better ensure that children are at the centre of decision making. There needs to be a systemic approach to recognising key bodies within the third sector as essential partners. Future planning should include structured collaboration with previously identified core partners and with the relevant infrastructure, information sharing networks and expertise to work in partnership with government. This could act as a shadow task force, ensuring readiness for future challenges. Coram also recommends that regulations and national directives should not be published without clear accompanying guidance to support their implementation. It is considered that once that architecture is in place, this will enable mobilisation plans to be implemented, for example, to plan to mobilise retired essential workers in children's social care. Coram considers that in future there will be a heightened need to use trusted channels and deploy open communication. This will be even more important in any subsequent emergency. Otherwise, there is a real prospect, with the ascent of AI, that the nation's response will be written by the likes of ChatGPT, with all its errors and delusions, rather than by experts with the institutional memory and experience to make a difference. The evidence from Coram demonstrates that local authorities and others did work hard to secure ongoing support for children in care. However, those working in children's social care would be better able to meet the challenges of any future pandemic if there was clearer guidance which would immediately fall into place and which was already known to them in advance. Children in potentially dangerous edge of care situations did not fare as well and did not receive the support of the sort to which they were entitled. This group should be given the top priority in any future planning, with specific steps to ensure they are always able to access places of physical safety beyond the home, for example, schools and foster care. Young people whose lives are subject to the civil courts all experience delay, and any delay is inimical to their welfare. Indeed, the court process itself is unacceptably overextended, even in normal times. For those who are subject to immigration and asylum controls, this is effectively a sentence to a life on hold. Children and young people in the immigration system who are fleeing abuse or persecution are particularly in need of our protection and social generosity. They are uniquely ill-equipped and unprepared to navigate the challenges which a pandemic brings. They should not be placed in unregulated accommodation, which can leave them vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation by criminal gangs. The inquiry has and will receive evidence in respect of how children with medical concerns fared during the pandemic, but there is much of which the NHS can be proud. Those working to address children with health needs should be commended. For its own part, Coram was pleased to see the government respond to calls to make reasonable adjustment to lockdown protocols, for example, for children and young people with autism. However, in any future lockdown, children as a much broader group should be subject to different rules. There needs to be child-specific lockdown guidance. Again, children cannot in future be treated as they were all too often during the COVID-19 crisis, as an afterthought or as little adults. Coram suggests that all children should be subject to specific guidelines dependent upon age, special educational needs, medical need, and the nature of the pandemic infection. The government cannot wait for the next pandemic. The guidelines could and should be written now. This can form part of a longer-term overall consideration at cross-party level of the requirement for an intergenerational settlement. It must recognise that children should not suffer the collateral damage as a result of the concerns which differently impact on adults. In addition, it is important to engage proactively with the needs of that subgroup of children whose families are homeless and who rely upon the state for adequate housing and space to play and study. The number of children experiencing homelessness and inappropriate accommodation and experiencing poverty has increased, with predictable effects on their health and other outcomes. In this context, Coram published a Charter for Children, which calls upon our nation to make a triple key commitment and reset our relationship with children. In doing so, we must avoid pitting one generation against any other. However, it's important to recognise and redress the fact that there has been an erosion of the collective will to share resources with children. This has long-term impacts. It will take more than one Parliament and more than one generation to address the deficit, so that this too must start now. Finally, during any pandemic, there will be children who are experiencing some level of support from the state who are about to turn 18 and need a smooth transition to adult support services. What the pandemic did was to weave its fingers into every crack in our system, as shown, for example, by the transition from children to adult services, as seen in Coram's Disability, Disparity and Demand report regarding special educational needs, published in October 2024. There is an evident disparity between what local authorities consider to be the needs of their care population and their true needs. This may be a key area for improved data collection, together with support for migrant children to support future planning. There needs to be attention to this issue to prevent there being marked variations in expectation and provision. Coram recognises that the COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented, if not unique, challenges. It was a dynamic situation. Any future crisis will be a dynamic situation. Coram commends frontline workers, and in many ways the government is to be commended for their services to children, which were a lifeline to many. It hopes to work with government as a third-party sector partner in preparation for any future pandemic. My lady, I'm grateful.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. King. Ms. Beattie.
My lady, we act for 3 national disabled people's organisations, or DPO. They are Disability Rights UK, Disability Wales and Disability Action Northern Ireland. At the outset, DPO want to address you on 3 matters. First, using vulnerability as a basis for policy making. Second, needs beyond learning and educational attainment. And third, accessibility. First, vulnerability. My lady has heard the DPO repeatedly caution against reliance on the concept of vulnerability in place of the social model, which recognises that many of the hardships which disabled children and young people face are determined by social, economic and political choices and circumstances. In this module on children and young people, the DPO do so again with added emphasis, because in this module, reliance on the superficially appealing concept of vulnerability in place of proper and informed planning and public policy respecting rights and meeting needs reaches its nadir. Like protecting the NHS or throwing a ring of steel around care homes, keeping schools open for vulnerable children sounds like something the government should have done. But it begs the question, vulnerable to what? In the statutes and guidance setting out disabled children and young people's entitlement to have their social care and education needs met, we do not find vulnerability used as a test or threshold. As recognised by the education experts instructed by the inquiry, Professor Gillian McCluskey and her colleagues, defining and measuring vulnerability is complex, messy, highly subjective, and influenced by local and national context. Yet it was to this problematic concept that the government turned in March 2020 when making the momentous decision to close schools. Both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Education said that schools would not be closed for children who were most vulnerable. They did so notwithstanding that no approach to determining the vulnerability of the millions of children and young people attending schools, early years and further education had been agreed. And a systematic and effective approach to assessing vulnerability was, in fact, never achieved. What followed was not that schools looked after the most vulnerable children, including disabled children and young people, but the very opposite. A tiny proportion of eligible children continued to attend school. Many were not looked after in the real sense of having their ongoing and newly arising needs met. And those left at home were looked after less still. The alarm was raised about low attendance by vulnerable children almost immediately. And by mid-April 2020, the SAGE subgroup was prompted to ask, where are these children? What are they doing? How are they being supported? Why are children with special educational needs and disabilities or education, health and care plans not attending? My lady, this was mid-April 2020, when children should have been shortly to return to school after Easter, and when what was described by the UK Chief Medical Officers 4 months later, in August 2020, as a certainty of long-term harm to many children and young people from not attending school, had yet to come to pass and could yet have been avoided. Next, needs. What was needed was not a makeshift reaching for the emotive concept of vulnerability, but practical focus on meeting the needs of disabled children and young people, not only for education, but also for care and support, needs which arose from impairments, but also from poverty, from the digital divide, from family and other circumstances, and from the pandemic itself. For disabled children and young people, the law required that local authorities promote their welfare and safeguard them from harm. To this end, many disabled children and young people receive social care services such as personal care and assistance, care and support within the home and within the community, respite care and travel support, including, importantly, under Section 17 of the Children Act 1989 and Section 2 of the archaically named Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970. For children with education, health and care plans, the law required that provision was made as specified in those plans. Very often this included provision delivered by allied health professionals, such as speech and language therapists, occupational therapists and physiotherapists, to children and young people at crucial stages of development. Children and young people without plans also received special educational needs support from school and accessed allied health professionals through the NHS. Yet previously available formal and informal support stopped, and education, health and care needs provision, assessment and review work was withdrawn. The DPO stress these aspects of social care and health provision for disabled children and young people, not only because they are fundamental to meeting needs, but because they go beyond the lost learning focus of some of the government evidence to the inquiry and beyond social or socialisation services in the nature of after-school clubs and the like. This is where the DPO think the focus on schools was too narrow. Disabled children and young people were having other identifiable and necessary services cut with eyes wide open to the adverse effects. It did not need nuanced social work assessment of hidden harms to identify the obvious, profound, and in some cases immediate consequences for disabled children and young people from failing to meet needs that were already known about. The predictable consequences included children left in pain, children who lost the ability to walk or to mobilise independently, to eat independently or to communicate. Children who lost around 2 years of therapeutic support, which reduced their progress and in some cases meant they went backwards. And for those close to the point of leaving school, at a time of transition to adult life, their changing needs were not assessed. These were not unexpected ripple effects of school closures, but involved choices by government. choices to downgrade pre-existing and long-standing statutory duties to disabled children and young people, including the duty in Section 42 of the Children and Families Act 2014 to secure provisions specified in a child or a young person's education, health and care plan. Choices to redeploy health and allied health personnel away from providing services to children. Choices not to prioritise the delivery of social care services relied on by disabled children and young people and their families. Choices to remove the requirement to assess young carers' needs for support. Choices to disapply duties which are designed to ensure a smooth transition for young people entering the adult social care system. My lady, in all that the inquiry is about to hear about the impact on learning, the DPO urged that disabled children and young people's holistic needs and their everyday needs for care and support are borne in mind. Finally, accessibility. All children and young people were affected by education closures and the move to remote learning, but not all experienced it equally. The duty to make reasonable adjustments is enshrined in equality law, and yet when it came to remote learning, disabled children and young people encountered basic barriers to access, which compounded the digital divide they already faced. Some examples. Disabled children and young people with visual needs found that worksheets were not in large enough font to read. E-learning options were incompatible with assistive technology. Children and young people with hearing impairments struggled to follow online lessons. Some were unable to find interpreters. For some disabled children and young people, online learning was not learning at all. My lady, the DPO do not underestimate the challenge to all nations of the UK of providing effective remote learning on the scale required. But as with other aspects of the pandemic response, such as access to vaccines and therapeutics and access to information, basic barriers of access prevented disabled children and young people from continuing their education on an equal basis with others. Remote learning, like lockdown, was not imagined for disabled children and young people. It was imagined for the non-disabled student and their non-disabled family. This failure of imagination and incapacity for inclusive policy making is recurrent, but it is not inevitable. We could have policy based on needs, rights and co-production. The tale of how school closures were planned from scratch and how disabled children and young people fared during the pandemic has at least the value of showing how much the UK still has to learn on this front, and that the system is vulnerable, not its children and young people. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Beattie. Very grateful. Mr. Wagner, King's Counsel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, my lady. As you know, I act for clinically vulnerable families, which I'll refer to as CVF, and I appear with Hayley Douglas and Lamisa Iqbal, and I'm instructed by Kim Harrison and Shane Smith of Slater and Gordon. I'll begin with the voice of a 13-year-old, let's call him David, quoted in a landmark CVF report coming this Wednesday. I don't go to school anymore. I want to keep going to my school, but they won't keep me safe. If I catch a virus, I will be sick for a very long time. I tried to go back to my school in September 2020, but my school did not look after me like they promised my mum. They made me use hand gel all day long, even though I was allergic to it. They didn't wear masks. Within a few weeks, I'd caught a nasty virus, and I was in bed for several weeks, trying to get better. They did not give me much schoolwork to do because they said they did not want to encourage me to stay at home. Then there is Lana. She said this: my mum said, do you want to go to school? Do you want to go to secondary school and risk taking this home? So as a 14-year-old, I had to make the decision to either get an education and risk my mother dying, or not get an education and try to teach myself as best I could. Lana stayed in virtual isolation for 2 years, including teaching herself GCSEs rather than risk her mother's life. Her school refused to continue remote teaching and threatening fines for non-attendance. Lana's story is reported in this morning's Guardian, and she's a clinically vulnerable families member, and she is sitting in the hearing room today. CVF will speak for two groups of children in this module. First, the children who are themselves clinically vulnerable to COVID-19, like David. And it's a myth, of course, that children were basically unaffected by COVID-19. Thousands of them were and remain clinically vulnerable. Between February 2020 and March 2022, 88 children died from COVID-19. In the first year of the pandemic alone, there were over 6,000 paediatric COVID-19 admissions, 4% of which, over 600, over 250, needed paediatric intensive care. Then there are the many thousands of children who have been impacted by long COVID and other serious conditions. The second group CVF speaks for is the children who lived in households with clinically vulnerable family members, like Lana. And that's a much larger group involving millions of people. And they face Lana's terrible dilemma: stay at home and miss education, or go to school and put relatives at serious risk. On behalf of those two groups, I'll make three submissions. First, schools must be made safe. Second, where schools cannot be made safe enough, children must be given appropriate support. And third, we cannot offer safety and support unless we recognise the impact COVID-19 has had and continues to have on clinically vulnerable children and families. So what CVF are asking for is safety, support, and recognition. Safety. It's obvious from the expert and other evidence to this module that it's better for a child if they're educated in school and are able to socialise with other children. But behind this is a dilemma. During a pandemic or epidemic, it's inevitable that some children will need to stay at home, either because, like David, infection will have a serious impact on their own health, or because, like Lana, it will have a serious impact on somebody else's in their house. Some clinically vulnerable children will need to stay at home unless the buildings they need to access are safe. And in the sense that, and by that I mean that measures are put in place to protect against the transmission of airborne viruses, or however a pathogen spreads. Professor Catherine Noakes says in her inquiry evidence that there's a growing body of evidence that enabling better ventilation and indoor air quality in school environments will have a positive effect on the health of children in general. The solutions are right there in front of us: ventilation, air quality checks, masks. But there still needs to be a paradigm shift away from the way we think about safety at schools. Keeping children safe from pathogens must be seen as just as important as keeping them safe from other hazards, like unsafe playground equipment or fire. And the inquiry can play an important role in changing perceptions. It's important not to be defeatist about school safety just because it's difficult, just because the estate is crumbling. Perhaps part of the problem behind some of the pessimism is that many so-called safety features or measures in schools in 2020 and 2021 were focused on the wrong pathogen: hand washing and social distancing in small classrooms. In a way, they may have done more harm than good because they gave people the impression they were being kept safe, but they weren't. It is possible to deal with this issue. The IPC experts in the healthcare module made clear recommendations. CVF remains concerned that no expert evidence is available in this module on safety, but we will say more in closing submissions about how the inquiry can use the totality of the evidence it's received to make meaningful recommendations on this important topic. We do say this now to respond to the somewhat pessimistic approach to safety identified so far today. When it comes to child safety, we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. My second submission is about support. Even if a pathogen is quickly understood and the right safety measures put in place, it won't always be possible to make schools safe enough We certainly agree with Ms Dubbin on that. Some children will need to remain at home some of the time. Children like Lana, who need to protect her mum, and David, who needs to protect himself. And those children must be supported. Their right to education must be preserved. And that means government guidance which recognises their position and is sensitive to it. School attendance policies that don't mandate in-person attendance for children in their position and are flexible. And access to high-quality remote and hybrid education options. And this, unfortunately, often did not happen for clinically vulnerable families. Either they were forced to attend school or faced fines and even prosecutions, or they were refused remote education access. To summarise, if we can't keep children safe, we must give them support. Third and finally, recognition. The impact of clinical vulnerability on COVID-19 on children and their families is poorly evidenced and not well understood. For a brief period, there was increased public understanding and empathy, but once the emergency stage of the pandemic receded, so did that understanding. That emergency phase may have passed, but for many clinically vulnerable people, the pandemic is not over. Some still face significant risks from contracting COVID-19, especially because of the removal of almost all measures which were put in place to protect them. Some clinically vulnerable children and children in clinically vulnerable families continue to shield and lead limited lives. To properly understand the ongoing effect, clinically vulnerable people must be recognised as a distinct group, which is included in decision-making, data collection, public reporting, and funded research. Recognition should also include making clinical vulnerability a protected characteristic in the Equality Act. And this will ensure that clinically vulnerable people and the challenges they face remain visible and protected when society's attention moves on. So, there must be safety when in school, support when not, and in the meantime, recognition. Over the next 4 weeks, the inquiry has an opportunity to listen to clinically vulnerable people, learn from the past and plan for the future. We all accept that in-person education is vital, but it's not always possible. Making schools safer, even if that doesn't mean making them 100% safe, while supporting and recognising the dilemmas that clinically vulnerable people face, is the only way to ensure that children like Lana and David are not let down again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wagner. Ms. Younger.
My lady, I appear on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland. I'm led by Ms Hannett KC, who sends apologies for being unable to attend today, and we are instructed by Jane Ryan of Bat Murphy Solicitors. Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland are grassroots advocacy organisations made up of parents whose children developed long COVID after not recovering from a SARS-CoV-2 infection. Their members were forced to become patient advocates for their children. They and their children have faced disbelief and inaction by the very government bodies who ought to have protected them. Many of their children have suffered incalculable losses to their physical health, their education, their social and their family lives. Many of the parents have become their children's full-time carers, with the consequential loss of employment and income and damage to their own social and family lives. My clients asked the inquiry to treat the devastation caused to children's lives as a human rights issue and to conclude that the actions of government in respect of the new childhood disease of long COVID failed to comply with children's rights to education, health and family life, and the right not to be discriminated against on the grounds of disability. Further, my clients asked the inquiry to conclude that decision makers evidently failed to prioritise the best interests of children in making, or more often omitting to make, decisions about paediatric long COVID. To that end, my clients pose 4 core questions. First, why was the physical impact of the virus on children and young people deprioritised, given that some were harmed? Paediatric long COVID was a foreseeable consequence of COVID-19 infection. Indeed, the adverse effects of long COVID on children were apparent very early on in the pandemic. Despite this, the evidence shows that the government overlooked the physical harm that the virus poses to children. Rather, decision makers approached the pandemic applying three flawed assumptions: that children would not be physically harmed by COVID-19, that they didn't require protective policy measures, and that they only needed to be considered as conduits of viral transmission to the adult population. This approach left some children suffering from serious physical illness with disabling symptoms and without government acknowledgement. The words of Jay, aged 10, encapsulate the experience of many like her. She says, "No one at school or in health believed me until I ended up in crisis in hospital with a feeding tube. All the doctors asked about was how I see myself in the mirror." Jay was very active and loved to roller skate with her family. Now she needs a wheelchair and can't walk or attend school. Turning to the second question, we ask, once it was known about, why was there a deliberate minimization of the physical harm the virus poses to children and young people? Even once the physical harm to children was known about by the scientific community and by government, the risks of long COVID were either minimized or ignored. For example, a consultant paediatrician at Public Health England advised a permanent secretary stakeholder group on education against labelling children and young people as having long COVID. This both minimises the harm of long COVID, but also overlooked the reality that children and young people who actually had long COVID were being disbelieved, not excessively diagnosed. The final words of the impact film were, "We shouldn't sacrifice children." In striking contrast, the Cabinet Office in the summer of 2021 referred to the strategic risk of accepting that the bulk of long COVID cases during the release of restrictions would be younger, unvaccinated individuals. A four-decision paper produced at the same time by Michael Gove, entitled Planning for Periods of High Prevalence, similarly stated that cases of long COVID in children would, and I quote, "rise rapidly." The COVID-19 Public Health Directorate team in the Scottish Government advised on the removal of all NPIs for under 12s in July 2021, accepting the health risk that some children would suffer from long COVID, as, and again I quote, "the virus ran unchecked amongst children." The evidence shows that government policies knowingly allowed children and young people to acquire COVID and develop long COVID. Even those whose job it was to advocate for children and young people, such as the Children's Commissioners and the Royal College of Paediatricians and Child Health, for the most part took no adequate steps to help children with long COVID, even after its harm had been made clear to them. E, age 16, explains how this feels. She says, "I've also been abandoned by the people who are supposed to help me, the NHS. The government talks about the stretches it has taken to support the NHS and help people. However, I haven't seen any of this. I've been refused chronic fatigue services because I was out of area, so the Trust refused funding because, and I quote, "it would open the floodgates for other people," which is appalling. How do you expect us to get help when the people we are forced to turn to act as if we are making it up for the fun of it? This isn't fun. I've spent the last 2 years ignored, and I need any help I can get to have long COVID properly recognised as the debilitating illness it is. As to the third question, why did the government not promulgate policy aimed at protecting children and young people against the impact of paediatric long COVID? The cohort of children and young people affected by long COVID is significant. The most recent prevalence data published by the ONS in April 2024 for 3 to 17-year-olds in England and Scotland found that over 111,000 children had persistent symptoms of any duration, and more than 65,000 of those children are estimated to have symptoms lasting 12 weeks or more. This compares with, for example, the 36,000 children and young people across all 4 nations who are estimated to suffer from childhood diabetes. SARS-CoV-2 continues to be in circulation. And so the number of children and young people who will develop long COVID following infection and reinfections of the virus is growing. As Professor Whitty confirms, some children have still not recovered from COVID infection. In that context, the policy was and remains entirely inadequate. The evidence confirms that long COVID was not a factor taken into account when considering school closures, when the illness had been identified and understood. Schools have not been instructed to collect data on absences caused by long COVID. The impact on education is therefore not being monitored, much less responded to. In the impact film this morning, we had one young person ask, why was it my responsibility to make sure school was safe enough for me to attend? Patient advocates are still having to fight for clean air in educational settings. There remains no guidance to schools on how to support children with long COVID to access education safely. Indeed, for the first time in 2025, 5 years after COVID-19's onset, the Department of Education's key research area now includes a question on how best to mitigate against the impact of long COVID on educational achievement. The inquiry is urged to explore why it has taken 5 years to ask and identify this question, and why, in the meantime, have children and young people with long COVID been left without adequate support. Further still, healthcare for children and young people with long COVID remains hopelessly inadequate. There are no dedicated clinics for paediatric long COVID in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, and many services in England have been closed, while several more are closing. The parent of B, age 6, explains, we had to use the educational support pack from long COVID kids with school. We could find no guidance at all from the Department of Education. From the attendance and infection control guidance, it was clear to us that a child like B was not supposed to exist. That leads me to the fourth and final question, my lady, which is, why were the public, parents and carers not informed of the indiscriminate risk of paediatric long COVID by clear public health messaging? Even now, there remains no public health messaging on the risk of paediatric long COVID published by any government department in any of the 4 nations. Rather, the message was and remains that children are not at high risk from COVID-19 and that the illness would be mild with no lasting consequences. That was not true 5 years ago, and it is not true now. The inquiry is asked to conclude that the absence of a warning, the lack of acknowledgement and advice by all 4 governments constitutes a significant public health failure. It has perpetuated and reinforced the disbelief and isolation of children and young people suffering from long COVID, and it should be remedied as a matter of urgency. We conclude with the words of Helen Goss of Long COVID Kids Scotland. We are a family in crisis. Heartbreakingly, we are not alone. Our experience is shared by tens of thousands of families across the UK who are now caring for children and young people suffering from a new chronic childhood disease and its varying degrees of disabling symptoms. My lady, unless I can insist any further, those are the opening submissions on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland.
Thank you very much indeed for your help. Ms. Anadiki, there you are. I knew you were here because I saw you arrive. Are you switched on?
Can you hear me?
Yep, can now.
Sorry. I act on behalf of the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People, and that's a statutory office, as my lady knows, established with the principal aim of safeguarding and promoting the interests of children and young people. And that's a group that, as at the last census, represented approximately 21% of the total population. And that includes significant numbers who were disproportionately adversely impacted by the pandemic, such as approximately 330,000 in school, with over a quarter of them from poor households, 22,500 regarded as being in need, and somewhere between 17,500 and 30,000 acting as young carers. And it's a matter of some concern that we don't actually know how many of them there are. written submissions have been provided that give further details about numbers and impacts and the need to have the UNCRC incorporated into domestic law, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But what I do want to do is use the opportunity that my lady has kindly given us to do two things. Firstly, to address what children and young people in Northern Ireland went through and the continuing impact of them. And second, to highlight what they still don't know, despite being 5 years away from the onset of the pandemic. So what they went through. Now, much, as my lady knows, has already been set out, analysed and explained about the impact on children and young people of the pandemic and the government's responses to it. What I want to do now is to use their words from a representative sample of what those who were vulnerable went through. And my lady has already had some examples of them, but sometimes it's the words of children and young people that speak most eloquently as to the impact on them. So Elodie, 10 years at the start of the pandemic. COVID impacted so many people. For me, I lost my grandfather as his cancer treatment was stopped due to hospital pressures, and we cared for him at home until he died in July 2020. I was 10, and I remember reading our favourite book to him just before he passed away, one that he had read to me so many times. Guess how much I love you? Well, I loved him to the moon and back. I and many other children lost access to educational paths that we had hoped for. The post-primary transfer tests were suspended unexpectedly the week before I was due to sit the first exam. I'd hoped to go to grammar school and applied for them, but in June 2021, I found out that I was unplaced and I had no school to go to. Following many appeals, I got access to my current school, and I started about 2 or 3 weeks later than everyone else. I suffered anxiety for the first year, and now even in year 12, I still have that doubt in my mind, do I really deserve my place here? For some, COVID may seem to be in the rearview mirror, but for others, it's still in the driving seat, both psychologically and educationally. It may be 5 years ago, but its continuing impact cannot be forgotten and must be recognised and considered. And Seren, who speaks on behalf of Molly, who was 8 years old, I live in a household with clinically vulnerable family members. My sister Molly and later my dad are both vulnerable to infection due to their health conditions and disabilities. And we don't fit the typical story that the lockdowns were detrimental, as my sister and I really thrived. The lockdown periods where everyone had to stay at home meant that my family was safe. People were more empathetic, particularly around protecting the most vulnerable. And due to her disabilities and clinical vulnerability, Molly was one of the first cohort of children to be prioritised for vaccines. The vaccination clinic had no ventilation, and our mum and Molly were the only two wearing masks. In order to protect Molly from the effects of COVID, we had to put her at risk of being in close contact with unmarked staff to access the vaccine needed to protect her. People often refer to COVID as a period in time, in the past sense, not the damaging virus that it is. But for families like mine, it continues to be an ongoing risk and has led to inequalities and unnecessary health risks. Families like ours can choose to avoid crowded indoor settings where there is a higher risk, but schools and healthcare settings cannot be avoided and therefore need to be made safer for everyone. Seren, who was 13, lockdowns were when I felt safest, and it seemed like there was better understanding about vulnerable families like mine. But I eventually had to go back to school, and mitigations began to be lifted. There was no real understanding. The risk to my family was still there. I continued to wear a mask, to try my best to protect my sister, and I asked for windows to be open for ventilation. I was eventually the only child wearing a mask and became a target for bullying, not just from other students, but staff and even parents. I was coughed at, sworn at, verbally abused, physically abused, had windows slammed shut, and experienced targeted abuse on social media, and it only got worse over time. I tried explaining the risk to my sister, but people said things like, well, you and your sister should just kill yourselves. And I don't care if your sister dies. School became terrifying. The failure of my school to manage the very real risks from COVID and the behaviour of other people forced me to make the decision to leave school halfway through my A-levels. All my teenage years have been impacted by the pandemic. We were told to protect the most vulnerable. But why, as you've heard from the film, was it my responsibility to make sure my school was safe for me to attend? My sister is now 13 and still extremely vulnerable. Outside of my family, who's protecting her now? Nikki, which is not her real name, 13. Throughout the pandemic, I felt isolated and voiceless at times. Shortly before the pandemic, I began to be unable to attend school due to mental health difficulties and undiagnosed learning difficulties. When school closed, I began to learn at home, and due to experiencing homelessness, I was left in an overcrowded housing situation with 4 other relatives, including one of my parents. So not only did I struggle to find a quiet space for learning, but also to somehow fill the blanks of months of missed teaching. I never returned to school full time, which led me to leaving school at 16 with no qualifications. I feel as though disabled young people and those with learning disabilities were not considered almost at all during the pandemic, and very little was done to support us. I feel as though young people were constantly being scapegoated throughout the pandemic and being blamed for spreading the virus, even though many, like me, followed every single rule and made incredible sacrifices. What made me particularly upset was the revelations around some of those who made the rules breaking them. Many young people are struggling with their mental health more than ever, and many are also still struggling educationally. I feel incredibly frustrated by how the decisions were made, particularly didn't seem to take into account disabled young people, those living in poverty, or those without the technology to complete schoolwork at home. And then there's Sarah, 10 years. During the time of COVID, all young people lost their voice. Support systems for SEN and neurodivergent young people drastically declined due to the inability to have meetings in person. For the most part, this group of young people were left practically abandoned. The mental health and well-being of children had one of the greatest falls during COVID period. The level of fear the pandemic inflicted onto our generation is startling. Young people now are a lot more introverted. They seem to avoid going out. And this makes perfect sense, because when you tell a child that there are germs everywhere and that if you get infected, you and your family could die, that will leave a psychological damage. Emotionally based school avoidance has spiked in recent years, and it's clear to see that COVID played a part in this. Young people felt safer in their homes, away from germs. So that was the first thing, my lady, I wanted to do. And the second thing, rather shorter period of time, is to actually pose what they want to know, or what they hope this module can do for them. Many children and young people are highly knowledgeable about the ways in which they were let down, and they have real insight into what was and is required. And in general, in Northern Ireland, they want to know 6 things. 1, why were they not made an integral part of any pre-pandemic plan, or once it was appreciated that COVID was likely to become a pandemic, why were they not factored into planning from the outset, especially as they were highly represented in vulnerable groups? 2, why those who had particular knowledge of their circumstances or who had direct contact with them were not properly consulted or involved in planning for the response to COVID, especially as it was known that there had been insufficient or inadequate pre-pandemic planning and that there was an urgent need to respond and absolutely no time for government to play catch-up. 3, why, when plans began to develop in haste, was no real consideration given to how some of the most dramatic measures, such as lockdown and school closure, would impact on them, nor why those working with them were not consulted to make use of their experience, especially as they were ready to assist. 4, why the plans and measures introduced failed to include adequate mitigating measures to avoid or at least reduce some of the most harmful impacts on them. 5, what coordinated work is being done now by the government to identify the full implications of some of the consequences of the pandemic and the measures introduced in response that have particularly affected them, such as long COVID, lost learning, decreased school attendance, increased economic deprivation, reduced life chances, long-term mental health issues and epigenetic responses, and what is now in place to help them. And then finally, what is being done now to improve planning, given the well-publicised resource constraints in Northern Ireland? And how will they be involved to improve pre-pandemic planning, pandemic responses, and ensure their rights are properly protected? To date, my lady, children and young people in Northern Ireland do not consider that they have received any meaningful answers or explanations, and they truly look to the inquiry, particularly this module, in the hope that it will help them with that. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed for your help. I think probably we'll take our break now. I shall return at 3:10. Mr. Gardner. Oh, there you are.
Good afternoon, my lady. I appear on behalf of the Children's Commissioner for Wales. The Children's Commissioner thanks the inquiry for allocating her core participant status in this important module and considers and hopes that she and her office can assist in understanding the impact and challenges brought by COVID-19 for children and young people in Wales. The Commissioner anticipates that the inquiry will also benefit from the learning and experience of the Commissioner on some of the practical arrangements, legislation and guidance which Wales has in place to protect the rights of young people, and which may have benefited children and young people across the UK had the same measures been in place. The Commissioner, in particular, recommends to the inquiry the Welsh legislation which brings children's rights to the centre of decision-making in the Rights of Children and Young Persons Wales Measure 2011. This requires the Welsh ministers to have due regard to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, when taking decisions. Other more discrete legislation, for example, Section 7 of the Social Services Wellbeing Wales Act 2014, creates a similar duty for any decision makers, principally local authorities in Wales, when taking decisions under that Act. The Commissioner also recognises and again recommends to the inquiry the approach in Scotland, which has gone further than Wales in directly incorporating the UNCRC into Scottish law in the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Act 2024. The Commissioner highlights at the outset that she considers that the liaison between her office and the Welsh Government during the pandemic and the willingness of the Welsh Government to learn and adapt was often productive and positive and good practice. The Commissioner and her office had regular involvement in influencing the development of guidance, and the Commissioner commends to the inquiry the model of the Shadow Social Partnership Council, which allowed ministers, officials and the Chief Medical Officer for Wales to explain the rules, the latest evidence and proposed major decisions, and allowed the stakeholders to issue concerns and raise issues. Whilst the Commissioner does commend the legislative and policy arrangements in Wales and the general willingness on the part of the Welsh Government to learn and listen, the inquiry is invited to consider the practice around these positive measures. Would such arrangements, had they gone further, or been followed more carefully, have provided greater protections to children and young people? Was there an implementation gap? The Commissioner believes that this is the case and that there are lessons to be learned. My lady, the pandemic had an immediate impact on all children and young people. Inequalities caused by race, poverty and disability in children became more pronounced. Vulnerable children who were at risk in their home lost the protective environment of the school. There was a rise in online offending and abuse. Children lost many activities that we all took for granted in childhood. These activities are an important part of the development of children, as recognised in Article 31 of the UNCRC. We are seeing longer-term adverse impact on children's confidence, school attendance and mental health since the pandemic. And whilst the pandemic had an immediate and devastating impact on older generations, the impact on children will be measured for a generation. The inquiry will need to consider the impact of the pandemic on children across the UK, but it must be recognised that different legal, policy, socio-economic, geographical and cultural backgrounds will mean different perspectives and impact in the devolved nations. The Commissioner can and will comment on the general impact on children and young people, but she is also uniquely poised to assist the inquiry with the specific impact on children and young persons in Wales. In accordance with Article 12 of the UNCRC, children and young people have a right to be asked and heard on their views about decisions which affect them. This right, and all other rights under the UNCRC, must be given due regard in all decisions taken by the Welsh Government, such as they affect children. All decision makers in the UK would do well to adopt the same principle. Adherence to this right has a practical importance, as listening to children and allowing opportunities to express views is identified by young persons themselves as being beneficial for mental well-being and has been shown to lead to more effective policy responses. In the view of the Commissioner, at the start of the pandemic, it is clear that the voices of young children and young people in Wales were not being adequately sought or considered. As the pandemic progressed, the Commissioner consistently requested, and to some extent secured, clearer messaging for children and young people and engagement with children and young people through discussion groups. My Lady, in order to ensure that the rights and voices of young children are considered, the Commissioner recommends to the inquiry the use of Children's Rights Impact Assessments, or CRIAs. In Wales, they are required by law in decisions taken by the Welsh Government which affect children. That is a result of the 2011 measure and the Children's Rights Scheme 2021. They are a tool which may be properly adopted by the UK Government and all public bodies in the UK. Whilst the Commissioner commends the use of CRIAs to the inquiry, it must be noted that the inquiry heard concerning evidence in Module 2B relating to failings in their use during the pandemic. These assessments are entirely designed to ensure decision makers have in their mind, whilst taking decisions, the impact of those decisions on some of the most vulnerable in our society. For some major decisions taken by the Welsh Government during the pandemic, no CRIA was completed at the time. 4 examples are the initial decision to close schools, when the Welsh Government was considering support for children with additional learning needs, relating to the use of face masks in schools, and on the impact of self-isolation on children. Furthermore, when CRIAs were completed, they were often completed late, far removed from the original decisions, and reflecting back. A CRIA should not be about retrofitting children's rights considerations into decisions that never had this in mind. This defeats the purpose of the CRIA, which is to ensure that the rights of children are at the forefront of their minds and may lead them to consider and mitigate the impact of their decisions on children before those decisions are taken and implemented. The Commissioner is concerned that the Welsh Government did not acknowledge the efficacy of CRIAs or their duty to undertake CRIAs to the detriment of children in Wales. My Lady, when the decision to close schools in Wales was taken by the then Education Minister for Wales on the 18th of March 2020, it does not appear that consideration was given to the 2011 measure, the 2021 scheme, or the UNCRC. The Commissioner was not consulted in the decision to close schools, and so to be clear, the Commissioner, as the statutory advocate of children's rights in Wales under the Care Standards Act 2000, was not consulted. Just as worrying, perhaps more worrying, the decision was taken without any legal advice. That is in contrast to decisions on closing businesses, caravan parks and footpaths in Wales, when legal advice was sought. It is presumably due to this lack of legal advice that the decision to close schools was taken by the Welsh ministers when, in the absence of the Coronavirus Act 2020, at that time, they had no legal power to do so. The lack of legal advice also denied them the opportunity to be reminded of their duties to children under the 2011 measure. In the light of this host of failures, the Commissioner asks, how were the educational, developmental and emotional harms which would impact children by being unable to attend school considered? How were the mitigating measures which could have been put in place to support children considered? The failure in process, the Commissioner fears, will have been to the detriment of the children of Wales. My Lady, the Commissioner is also concerned that inadequate consideration was given during the pandemic to the use of face masks in schools and to guidance and planning around their use. The Commissioner raised concerns over the use of face masks in the classroom, in the foundation phase, during the return to school in February and March 2021, and highlighted the impact on children with speech and language difficulties, those with hearing loss, and those whose first language is not Welsh or English. The Commissioner raised concerns over the inconsistency of approach by schools and unclear messaging and guidance. The Commissioner also raised concerns that the use of face masks for children had, later in the pandemic, fallen out of step with the rights of adults. When adults in Wales could sit in a pub with friends from 6 households and without wearing a face mask, secondary school pupils were required to wear them in school while seated all day and every day. The inquiry may wish to consider the benefits and detriments of face masks for children in schools, as well as how their use was continually assessed with children's rights in mind. My lady, during the pandemic, public-facing guidance was also issued from a number of different sources, including the UK Government, the Welsh Government and Public Health Wales. In youth justice settings, this was an increased area where the jagged edge of devolution caused practical difficulties when implementing the new legislation and guidance in Wales. This is one sector in which it became particularly apparent, because youth justice is not a devolved matter, whereas public health is. The Commissioner considers that there was an impact on young people in these institutions in Wales, as there was practical problems relating to the communication of guidance, which led to confusion in youth detention settings in Wales as to which guidance it should follow. Should it be health guidance from the Welsh Government or justice guidance from the UK Government? My lady, in conclusion, the impact on COVID-19 was sharply felt by children and young people in Wales, where high poverty rates, large rural areas with stretched services, and where large numbers who speak Welsh, not English, as a first language, exacerbated the impact. In times of great adversity and significant pressure on decision makers and their advisors, oversights may be understandable. But that is why systems must be in place to ensure that the rights and protections of children and young people are upheld. Children have a voice only if we help them to use it. Children are amongst those who will be the most impacted by monumental pressures on society. The system must be able to withstand the greatest of pressures, or it is an ineffective system. The Commissioner encourages the inquiry to consider the protection of children's rights across the UK. At present, the UNCRC rights of children are enshrined in law in Wales. This creates a due regard duty, which the Welsh Government must observe. But this leads to some important follow-on questions, which the inquiry may wish to consider. Firstly, were the due regard duties properly adhered to in Wales? Secondly, had the due regard principles been properly adhered to in Wales, would the impact on children and young persons in Wales have been mitigated? Thirdly, had similar due regard duties applied and been adhered to across the UK, would the impact on children and young people across the UK have been mitigated? And fourthly, had those protections been stronger, such as by direct incorporation of the UNCRC in similar terms to the Human Rights Act 1998, would the impact on children and young people across the UK have been mitigated? The Commissioner takes the preliminary view that the due regard duties were not fully and properly followed in Wales, and that had they been, the impact on the pandemic on children and young people would very likely have been mitigated. And further, had those protections been stronger, such as by direct incorporation of the UNCRC in similar terms to the Human Rights Act, as it has been in Scotland, the impact on children and young people across the UK may have been mitigated even further. My lady, the very final point goes to the invitation of other core participants to approach the module and its conclusions through the prism of children's rights. It is an important observation. Children should be guaranteed these rights, and when discussing decision-making around children, those discussions should be expressed in the language of rights and with children at the centre of decision-making. As with any language, learning the language starts with speaking it.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there, Mr. Gardner. I do very much have on board the point about human rights, but I'm afraid I've got to be fair to everybody. And you're a fair bit over.
Yes, my lady, I was simply going to say, once we speak it, we will start to think that way, and then I was to thank the inquiry for its time. I'm grateful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner. Very grateful. Now, who's next? Oh, Mr. Ober.
My lady, I represent the interest of the Local Government Association and the Welsh Local Government Association. The two associations very much closely work together and welcome the opportunity to contribute as co-participants in this module, as in others. Together, they represent the collective voice of local government, with 100% of Welsh and over 99% of English principal authorities. Local government played a critical part during the COVID, working for children and young persons, both in terms of education and personal support, but in many other ways as well. Both associations played their role also in supporting their members, and both have cooperated with the inquiry team in undertaking a survey between December 2024 and January 2025 for the purposes of this module. The survey questions were aimed primarily at the 151 English and 22 Welsh local authorities with statutory responsibilities for children's social care under the Children and Social Work Act 2017 for England and the Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014 for Wales, and there was a 100% return. So effectively, all the relevant authorities in both parts of the United Kingdom were respondents to the survey, and we heard this morning from counsel to the inquiry that the inquiry have found the reports of the survey results extremely helpful. The inquiry will find that it provides a rich overview of preparation for the pandemic and the capacity and actions of local government to meet the needs of children and young persons during it. The witness statement of Ms. Killian of the LGA and Dr. Llewellyn of WLGA set out extensive lessons learned and make significant recommendations for the future. On behalf of both of them, I commend these to the inquiry as an important contribution to this module. In this opening, I can only provide the briefest of summaries of the work that local government undertook on both a statutory and discretionary basis, and leave to the readers of their witness statements to discover how the associations contributed as advocates for their members or as consultees of English and Welsh governments. At the outset, it is often good to set some good ideas of the range and scale of local government's work for children and young people. In England, as in Wales, councils had many special responsibilities for children and young persons. Just how many will be evident from the fact that it is estimated that overall in England there are some 200 statutory duties covering education and children's social services. These duties include child protection, adoption and fostering, acting as corporate parents and for looked after children as caregivers, children in need, early education and childcare, ensuring fair access to a diverse supply of good schools, ensuring access to high-quality provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities, alternative provision for children outside mainstream education provision, providing suitable home-to-school transport, youth justice and services, children's health and well-being. The extent of these duties is such that councils are responsible for supporting around 12 million children. Proportionately comparable figures apply to Wales. It is important to remember that just as children and young persons did not, of course, disappear during COVID, neither did a single of these responsibilities. Indeed, in many cases, the necessary work was intensified, though as the survey shows, there were other areas where this could not have been so. The following figures provide a different way of looking at the extent of this work. Around 44% of local authority expenditure, about 14 billion, is spent in relation to children and young persons, including social care and education. Some 34,000 children and family social workers are employed by English councils. Well over 500,000 referrals are made annually. Again, the figures for Wales are proportionately comparable. The inquiry will look in detail at how this played out, but I can say now that simply heroic work by council staff ensured that vulnerable children, young people and families, as far as possible, continue to be supported. Schools were supported to ensure as many children as possible had access to education and new processes and systems. were also developed to do as much as possible to maintain these obligations. However, this work was by no means free from problems. There was a lack of national planning as to whether and how social distancing NPIs harmed children and what actions would reduce these effects. Some children were exposed to hidden harm when they were not being seen by professionals regularly, including harm from those in their homes or online. It is well established that there have been significant child mental health issues arising from COVID, the consequences of which have included lack of school readiness, reduced school attendance, poor in-school class behaviours, and other detriments to learning. Some groups of children were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, including those with special educational needs and disabilities, and those living in disadvantaged households. So, as it receives oral evidence and absorbs the written contributions, the inquiry will discover during this module just how much COVID-19 very greatly impacted the daily lives of children, their parents, and families, and how the evidence continues to grow that this will continue for a long time in the future. I will finish with a point about the passage of time. This module concerns events that occurred some 5 years or so ago, which lasted for more than two of them. At the end of a long life, that may seem a blink of an eye. To those who were children during COVID, 5 years will be more than a quarter of their lives, and while 2 will be more than 10%. Seen in that way, it will be appreciated that the significance of these events for them is huge. But it is also huge for all of us. Those who were children and young persons then are the coming generations of workers, entrepreneurs, and professionals. The module will discover how well we have protected them and what we could have done better and what we must do if another crisis occurred to ensure that we're better equipped to support our children and young persons. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ober. Very grateful. Mr. Jacobs.
My lady. These are the submissions of the Trades Union Congress. Unions affiliated to the TUC represent many of those who work across all roles and all levels of education: school leaders, teachers, teaching assistants, caterers, cleaners, and others. They also represent many in other roles who also have an interest in this module, such as educational psychologists, health visitors, school nurses, and prison officers. But in these opening submissions, our focus will be on education in the pandemic. The TUC and its affiliated unions pay tribute to the monumental efforts of school staff throughout the pandemic. A great many continue to attend places of education, irrespective of the risks and in a context in which protective measures were limited. They adapted to new ways of operating schools, to new ways of teaching, to new methods of assessment, to new ways of supporting vulnerable children, both in and out of school. Almost invariably, they did so at incredibly short notice, and they achieved it by going above and beyond. My lady, all recognise the fundamental point that losing out on face-to-face education harms children, and it particularly harms the most vulnerable. A question that follows is, what does that mean for the next pandemic? It is a difficult question, and counsel to the inquiry was right this morning to identify that it is not an area for simplistic or blunt answers. My lady, we make some general observations. First, perspective is important. The inquiry is just a few weeks off publishing its report from Module 2. The perspectives in that module included how it could be that this country suffered such terrible loss of life. The inquiry has also had the perspective of healthcare in Module 3 and of the daily horrors in ICU, of the perspective of social care in Module 6 and the terrible isolation and loss of life experienced by so many, Analysis within this module has to acknowledge and keep those perspectives carefully in mind, and acknowledge that those experiences impact children too, as we have heard on a number of occasions throughout today. Second, considering the weight of the interests at play across society is important, but it is no spoiler to state the nub of it. The interests are heavy and they can point in different directions. The real challenge is how best practically to chart a course through. This inquiry, this module, must try and illuminate that, how best practically to chart a course through. And we should not be under any illusion that in the next pandemic, by staring really hard at the problem, or by really understanding how bad restrictions on school attendance are for children, the answer, the course to chart, will reveal itself. My lady, it won't. Certainly, restrictions on school attendance must be kept to a minimum, but how? Presumptions of closing schools only at the last possible moment and reopening them at the earliest opportunity may actually be dangerous. It mistakenly assumes that the next pandemic will not pose terrible risks of death and injury to children and young people. But also, in a pandemic, earlier restrictions may mean fewer restrictions and less harm in the long run. If there is opportunity in the next pandemic to act early and effectively, it should be grasped. We wait to see the Module 2 report, but one lesson might be the pitfalls of acting too hesitantly and too late. If that is so, extolling a maxim of restrict attendance at the last possible moment may actually be a recipe for repeating the mistakes of the last pandemic. So what can we learn about minimising the harm to children and the course to chart? We can learn about the importance of resilience of our schools, of the importance of resource teachers who are retained and skilled, and of well-equipped schools. We can learn about the importance of reducing inequalities, particularly along lines of socioeconomic disadvantage. We can learn about the importance of preparedness, both in education and across society. The effectiveness of the broader societal response to a pandemic will likely be the greatest determinant of the impact of the next pandemic on children. We can learn, my lady, about the importance of a coherent plan for a pandemic response arrived in partnership with the sector, a plan that confronts and prepares for the realities of a pandemic and addresses them. A significant error in the context of education was an approach in summer 2020 of no plan B, that schools will open and nothing else will be discussed or planned for. That no plan B approach was arrived at in a context of a precarious R rate and clear scientific advice that further peaks were likely. It resulted in a chaotic lurching from a plan of no restrictions on attendance to prolonged restrictions. It was a plan for keep schools open and panic when you can't. We learnt, therefore, of the dangers of blindly setting one's face against restrictions on school attendance until the point at which it becomes impossible to do otherwise. My lady, that fundamentally is why unions were at times voices of caution on unrestricted attendance. It was not through a lens of caring more or caring less about the well-being and education of children, or about putting the interests of children above or below the interests of others in society. It was about the wish for a plan that maximised the safety of staff, of pupils and of community, and of continuity of education in the longer as well as the shorter term. My lady, we can learn about the fundamental importance of maximising safety within schools. It is one of the controllables in a pandemic. It can include a sensible mask policy, test and trace, rotated and staggered attendance, and ventilation. These prosaic but critical measures protect the physical safety of both pupils and staff, limit transmission, and inspire and promote confidence in attendance. We hope that in counsel to the inquiry pointing and opening towards some of the challenges and limitations of safety measures in schools, that we did not detect a whiff of fatalism, safety measures in schools can be a powerful tool, and in confronting a challenge for which there are no simple answers, measures that shift the dial should be grasped. We can learn, my lady, of the importance of bold plans for supporting both remote education and means of promoting well-being during periods of restriction. These are important lessons to be explored during this module. The TUC-affiliated education unions are proud of their contribution to the pandemic response. They worked hard for a profession that was worthy of and in need of support. They worked to support education staff and their safety, and also to support education staff in their teaching and caring for their pupils. There are a small number of witnesses who are critical of union caution on unrestricted attendance. The Welsh Government suggests that there was a conflict between the interests of education staff and the interests of children, and it seeks conclusions from the inquiry on how competing rights and considerations should be managed. My lady, the idea that the root challenge was the interests of staff versus the interests of pupils is wrong. Pupils and staff share fundamentally the same interests of safe schools in which pupils are present. It is also wrong because restrictions on attendance had nothing at all to do with the interests of staff. They were introduced because of exponentially increasing deaths in overwhelmed hospitals, and no decision maker says otherwise. In concluding, we must recognise and record the impact of the pandemic upon children and young people, but also confront the difficult questions about how, practically, to chart a course through. We chart a course, my lady, by entering the next pandemic with more resilience and less inequality, by determination in producing robust plans, by confronting the hard realities of a pandemic and addressing them with a coherent and realistic response, and by bold and committed plans to maximise safety when in school and optimising education and well-being when out of it. Those are all features to which the Trades Union Congress and its affiliated unions invite careful attention. My lady, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jacobs. Who's next? I'm sorry, I always have trouble pronouncing. Can you help me?
Bicaregi, my lady.
Bicaregi, thank you. I'm so sorry. I should have said at the beginning, if anybody can help with phonetic pronunciation, I'd be grateful. Yes.
Prynhawn da, my lady. I will be brief. You have the Welsh Government's written opening statement and its detailed witness evidence. The Welsh Government has a firm and enduring commitment to honour the rights of children and young people. As your ladyship is aware, the Welsh Government formally adopted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child as the basis for policy making relating to children and young people as early as 2004. And from 2012, the Rights of Children and Young Persons Wales Measure 2011 placed the duty on Welsh ministers to consider children's rights in all their actions and decisions. Your ladyship will pose the question, so what? Did the legal framework materially change the approach of the Welsh Government to decision-making in respect of children and young people? Was there an implementation gap, as my learned friend for the Children's Commissioner for Wales submits? What concrete evidence is there of a difference in approach in Wales? My lady, you have detailed written evidence, and you'll be hearing further evidence about that. But the Welsh Government's position, and this is reflected in the written evidence of others, is that it did matter, and it does matter, that in Wales the UNCRC has routinely been part of decision-making for the last 20 years. My lady, I do pause there to note that the Welsh Government has listened to the strength of opinion in favour of full incorporation of the UNCRC, which is in the room today. The Welsh Government would submit that the effect of the legal framework in Wales on decision-making in respect of children and young people's rights during the pandemic can be seen in the following examples. And, my lady, I'm not going to give an exhaustive list of the examples, but some of those are: firstly, working in partnership with the Children's Commissioner for Wales on the coronavirus and me surveys. Those surveys took place in May 2020 and in January 2021, and crucially incorporating the learning from those surveys into decision-making during the course of the pandemic. Secondly, being the first UK nation to commit to free school meals during school holidays. That happened in April 2020. in attempting to extend the summer term in 2020 and add a week to the October half term so that children and young people could return to school in the summer of 2020, and in not diluting the legal protections of those who had statements of special educational needs during the first months of the pandemic. But, my lady, to be clear, the Welsh Government acknowledges that it did not get everything right. And perhaps more importantly for the inquiry's purposes, it's open to interrogating its decision-making and considering what can be done differently and better in a future pandemic for children and young people. The Welsh Government acknowledges that there was inadequate planning to close schools for most children in March 2020. The Welsh Government has always accepted that it did not carry out a formal children's rights impact assessment and that it did not consult the Children's Commissioner for Wales before the announcement on the 18th of March that schools would need to close for most pupils. My lady, you'll be hearing evidence on the reasons for that, but children and young people were seriously affected, with disadvantaged and vulnerable children suffering the greatest effects, and the Welsh Government has learned this lesson. As to the context for that decision, it's clear from the contemporaneous documents that on the 17th of March and even into the morning of the 18th of March, it was hoped that schools would remain open. But, my lady, on the morning of the 18th of March, schools across Wales were closing due to staff illness. Children were not being sent to school by worried parents, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that the NHS was about to come under unprecedented strain. My lady, there's an uncomfortable trend in public discourse generally to seek to characterise decisions as self-evidently right or wrong and choices as black or white. The evidence you have received in this module, my lady, challenges that discourse. Within the written evidence, there are those who argue that the virus posed relatively little harm in health terms, to children, and therefore schools should not have been closed. Other core participants argue that decision makers did not take the health threat to children and young people sufficiently seriously when seeking to reopen schools or to take decisions. And we've heard that very powerfully this afternoon, my lady. My lady, these were complex decisions. Often they were least worst decisions. And in the early stages, they were taken under considerable pressures of time. My lady, the Welsh Government is grateful to you and to your team for the very detailed and careful consideration you're giving to these complex issues over the next 4 weeks, and the Welsh Government will help in any way it can. Lastly, the Welsh Government would like to take this opportunity to thank the children and the young people of Wales, to thank their parents and carers, the teaching profession, including all of the support and the administration staff, and all of the other professionals involved with the care and support of children and young people across Wales, social workers, further education staff, voluntary organisations, for everything they did during the pandemic. Diolch.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gregory. Very grateful. Ms. Drysdale. Oh, there you are.
Good afternoon, my lady. I appear on behalf of the Scottish Government with Ian Halliday, Christian Whitaker and Amelia Ma. The Scottish Government wishes to thank children and young people in Scotland and those who supported them for their extraordinary contribution throughout the pandemic to the wider protection of society. Children and young people in Scotland suffered untold losses, and the lower risk to them from the virus was not known at the outset. As the pandemic progressed, they made sacrifices to benefit and protect older generations. Children and young people suffered profound changes to their daily life and routine, including disruption to their education. There was a disproportionate impact on children from marginalised and disadvantaged groups. The Scottish Government appreciates the importance of school, early learning, wider childcare, and further and higher education for social and personal development, not just for learning. Although the impact of the pandemic was felt differently by different children, there are many who have suffered and who continue to suffer because of the pandemic. While many suffered directly due to the virus, others suffered losses which were less visible to society at the time. Mental health problems for children and young people increased. The damage caused by the pandemic is still ongoing and its full extent is unknown. Some continue to face health challenges. There have been lasting impacts on education and socialisation, and many lost loved ones. In this opening statement, I will address 4 of the key themes which will be considered by the inquiry as part of this module: closure of schools, remote learning, ensuring that the voices of children were heard, and the safety of children. It's not possible to address everything in detail in the time available, so I would also refer your ladyship to the Scottish Government's more detailed written opening statement. Turning to the first theme, closure of schools. The possibility of widespread school closures was first discussed by Scottish ministers in detail at a Scottish Government Resilience Room meeting on the 17th of February 2020. At that time, the scientific advice was clear that widespread school closures were not justified, but some temporary closures were likely. Local authorities began putting in place plans for hubs, digital provision of education, and arrangements for free school meals. The Scottish Government was aware of the need to ensure that children were protected in the event of school closures and took steps to maintain child protection systems. Guidance was provided together with additional funding. The Scottish Government acknowledges that there was widespread disruption to education, which had a significant impact on children and young people. The Scottish Government wished to keep schools and early learning and childcare open for as long as possible. It gradually became more difficult to sustain education provision following advice on self-isolation, social distancing, and declining attendance, with high levels of anxiety and uncertainty amongst parents and education staff. On the 18th of March 2020, following discussion at Cabinet and a follow-up meeting with the former First Minister, the former Deputy First Minister took the decision to close schools and early learning and childcare settings to control the spread of the virus and protect the vulnerable, with certain exceptions, including for vulnerable children and young people and the children of key workers. Turning to the second theme, my lady, remote learning. Access to digital learning was part of overall contingency planning prior to the pandemic. The Scottish Government funded a robust, high-speed broadband connection to each local authority and funded GLOW, Scotland's nationally available digital learning platform. GLOW was launched in 2007. It provides free and secure access to a range of online tools and services to deliver remote learning and teaching. During the pandemic, GLOW played a key role in ensuring that learners and teachers across Scotland were able to continue to learn from home. In the early stages of the pandemic, Education Scotland developed new materials to support both teachers and parents, including Parent Club and Scotland Learns. The aim was to offer additional resources and advice to teachers and parents. From March 2020, significant work was carried out to minimise the impact of digital exclusion by providing devices, systems, and funding to those in need. Local authorities collaborated in this and deployed connectivity solutions for disadvantaged children and young people. The Scottish Government provided funding and strategic direction, but left decisions to be made locally. There have been concerns about digital inequality and engagement in education. The Scottish Government sought to minimise the impact of online learning by providing devices, online platforms and funding to those in need. It has committed to continued investment in digital learning. It decided that schools were best placed to identify those experiencing digital exclusion. Turning to the third theme, my lady, children's voices. The inquiry may hear evidence that children and young people's interests and voices should be represented and respected in all relevant policy, including pandemic planning. The Scottish Government would agree with that recommendation. This is reflective of the way that the Scottish Government approached policy development and delivery both before and during the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, the Scottish Government commissioned the lockdown lowdown surveys, which assessed the impact of coronavirus on education, relationships, employment, mental and physical well-being, and access to information in relation to children and young people. Since the pandemic, the interests and voices of children and young people have been given further protection by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Act 2024. The Act incorporates the UNCRC into domestic law directly. It is now unlawful for a public authority to act or fail to act in a way that is incompatible with the UNCRC requirements in the Act when carrying out a relevant function. This includes giving every child the right to express their views freely in all matters affecting them and giving their views due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. Turning to the fourth and final theme, safety of children. In Scotland, local authorities have the primary statutory responsibility for delivering social work, social care and education services, and were best placed to make decisions about local service provision. The Scottish Government worked hard to ensure that arrangements were in place for the continued support of vulnerable children and young people, while respecting the primary role of local authorities in the delivery of that support. On the 31st of March 2020, the Scottish Government published guidance on the continued provision of support to vulnerable children and young people. It was for local authorities to determine, based on local knowledge, whether those children and young people needed access to local hubs. The inquiry may hear evidence that vulnerability was not adequately defined and that there was considerable local variation. In Scotland, local authorities were given discretion to identify vulnerable children in their area. The Scottish Government considered that it was important for there to be a high-level national definition supported by local flexibility to ensure that vulnerable children were not missed. Together with education, children's social work visits also moved to remote visits. There were some initial concerns about the effectiveness of remote visits, and the Scottish Government published guidance on these. Children's hearings and family cases heard in the Court of Session and the Sheriff Court were also moved to virtual hearings as part of the pandemic response. My lady, in conclusion, many members of the public, children, those working in education and members of the third sector experienced unimaginable trauma during the pandemic. There was also an extraordinary contribution for the greater good of society from those working in education, early learning practitioners, teachers and support staff, youth workers, social workers, lecturers and staff in college, universities, training providers and key workers, and from the voluntary and charity sector. Some sectors felt a lack of recognition for their efforts, such as early learning and childcare workers, and the Scottish Government wishes to pay tribute to them now for their exceptional public service, hard work and dedication. The human rights of everyone were restricted to prevent harm from the virus, with a significant emotional impact on children and young people. But most importantly, the Scottish Government wishes to repeat its thanks to children and young people in Scotland for their extraordinary contribution throughout the pandemic to the wider protection of society. It is only by acknowledging the harm caused to so many, despite the determined efforts of decision makers and those working with children and young people, that lessons can be learned and recommendations made to save lives and prevent loss in a future pandemic. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much for your help, Mr. Drysdale. Ms Ward, I think you complete the submissions today.
Good afternoon, my lady. I appear on behalf of the Department for Education, which I'll refer to as the DFE. I'm assisted by Mr Thomas, who's here today, and Ms Sullivan and Ms Masood. The DFE, as you will know, is the central government department with policy responsibility both for education and for children's social care, and as such, hopes to play a significant role in this module. My lady, unlike many of those who've spoken so far today, this is the first occasion on which I've addressed you orally. That is not because the DFE has not been engaging with the inquiry to date. I hope it's evident from both the volume and the detail of the evidence that's been provided to this module, and indeed to earlier ones, that the DFE has sought to take a proactive rather than reactive approach, and that it was considering both the lessons to be learned from the pandemic and indeed how it could best assist this phase of your inquiry well before any Rule 9 requests were received. As we've said in our written submissions, the DfE welcomes the focus of this module on children and young people and the scrutiny that this module will therefore bring to almost every aspect of the DfE's work during the specified period. We look forward to working with the inquiry and with other core participants to ensure that everything possible is learnt, both from what went well and from the mistakes that were made, in order that children and young people can be protected so far as that is possible from the worst impacts of any future pandemic. My Lady, Counsel to the Inquiry has rightly referred to deficiencies in planning for the first period of lockdown. Those deficiencies have been acknowledged in our written submissions and our evidence. There is obviously a question for the inquiry to investigate about where responsibility lay for planning for the impacts, in particular of school closures, between January and March 2020. However, I should make clear at this point that those lessons have been learned. The department, the DfE, has now put significant resources into resilience planning and accepts the need, and this is part of the key learnings we've set out in our written submissions, for clarity of responsibility and, critically, for there to be robust but adaptable plans that can be stood up in response to a future pandemic or other emergency. Even more so than in our written submissions, these oral submissions can only be a bare outline of some of the main issues. I hope to use what remains of my 10 minutes to set out very briefly the DfE's role in the two key systems that impact on children's lives, the education and care systems, and explain how that changed during the pandemic. And then to touch on two of the most critical issues for children, the impact of the pandemic on social work practice and the restrictions on attendance at school, which, in line with the steer my lady's previously given, we do accept is commonly referred to as closure of schools. But of course, they did remain open to some children. Teachers, as well as social workers, continued to work and to work hard throughout. The structure of the education and children's social care systems are such that DfE's role is ordinarily to set the framework, policy and priorities for a number of more or less autonomous bodies who deliver services for children and young people. There are two important points that arise out of that. Firstly, it increases the importance of partnership working and of building relationships. Secondly, it meant that the increased need for central direction and for organisation engendered by the pandemic required a shift from the DfE's usual patterns of working with partners across the system. The DfE sought to gather and respond to feedback from those partners throughout the specified period, and it seeks continuously to improve the relationships and systems that enable learning and good practice to be shared throughout the sectors for which it has responsibility. A number of those who've addressed you today have spoken about the importance of ensuring that children's rights, the impact on them, and what is in their best interests are given proper consideration when decisions affecting them are made. The DfE agrees with the thrust of those submissions. The inquiry will, of course, examine the extent to which a focus on those matters was or was not lacking, or could have been more structured or intense during the specified period. But it is important to be clear that the DfE did seek throughout to ensure that there was a focus on, in particular, the needs of vulnerable children and what was in their best interests. And it's also important to be clear, and this echoes some submissions you've heard from those who spoke just before me, certainly in relation to most of the decisions that this module will be considering, the needs of and interests of children and young people are not properly seen as being in direct conflict with the needs and interests of the adults who work to care for and to educate them. Those adults need to be working within a system that enables them to give their best. And so while there may be tension and factors pulling in different directions, it's necessary to take a holistic rather than a binary view. There will, of course, be different views on how best to promote those interests, but we are all on the same side, working to try to prevent harm to children and to maximise their potential. So very briefly then, social care, and a word firstly on a topic that's been raised by a number of others today, the adoption in children coronavirus amendment regulations. The inquiry will, of course, hear evidence from DfE and other witnesses about the decision-making process that lay behind those regulations and the judicial review that resulted. As we've made clear in the evidence and written submissions, the DfE accepts the result of that judicial review. There was no deliberate decision taken to exclude the Children's Commissioner in what was of necessity a rushed process at a time of great uncertainty. The DfE will and does ordinarily consult the Children's Commissioner when it's appropriate to do so, and indeed did in relation to the extension of some of those regulations. But what was and remains clear, as a finding made in the High Court, was that the intention behind the regulations was to protect looked after children who are at risk because of the consequences of the pandemic. And it's also, in my submission, important to be clear because there is some elision of different issues in some of the submissions and evidence that you'll see and hear, that most of the changes to social work during the specified period were not as a result of those regulations. The regulations provided flexibilities, most of which were not widely used. But in particular, the shift to remote contact for social work visits, for visits other than those mandated by the regulations that were amended, and those are the majority of social work visits, the shift there to remote visiting was a consequence of practice being adapted in the light of public health guidance. And another concerning feature, the drop in referrals into children's social care, was a result of children who were not previously known to be vulnerable, not being seen by services, and therefore not referred. And that, of course, brings us then to school closures. The DFE, in common with all core participants, recognises that closing schools to most children was hugely damaging to many of them, not only educationally and not only to the most vulnerable. We echo what Counsel to the Inquiry said about the importance of school, not just as a place of learning and development, but as a place of safety, a place of respite from difficult home situations. The DFE is clear that schools should not be closed if that can be avoided. Of course, far from the only, but a great focus of this module will be on the decisions that were taken around the closure of schools. There is a really difficult balance to be struck between trying to keep them open at all costs or, as Mr Jacobs has suggested, having targeted early closures to avoid longer ones later, but then potentially closing schools at a time when it may become apparent with hindsight that it wasn't in fact necessary. There simply are no easy answers, and we look forward to all of the complexities being fully ventilated in this module. Schools were, of course, kept open for vulnerable pupils. Attendance was obviously not high enough, although it improved considerably over time. An enormous amount of work was done, both by DFE and by professionals on the ground, to stand up remote education for those not able to attend. Again, we don't say that was perfect, but it is right to say that many lessons have been learned in that regard. And it is definitely one way in which the education system will unquestionably be better prepared and more resilient in any future pandemic or any emergency that might lead to the closure of schools. There's a great volume of evidence before the inquiry, including from the DFE in a corporate witness statement that's dedicated to the research that's been done on impacts, that identifies the enormous impacts that there were and continue to be on children and young people as a result of the pandemic. As we say in the written opening, most of DFE's current work is shaped by the need to address those impacts and to ensure that policy fits the needs of children and young people as they are now following the pandemic. The DFE has invested in numerous discrete programmes that are aimed at addressing specific impacts, and some of those are set out in our written opening. I won't repeat them now. The significance and severity of the impacts on children and young people are unquestionable, but there is also some positive evidence, and the DFE does caution against the risk of creating perhaps a self-perpetuating narrative, resulting in lowered expectations for this cohort. Many children and young people have achieved extraordinary things in the face of enormous challenges, including, but by no means limited to, the evidence that there is of recovery in academic attainment. The many achievements of children and young people in this period and their efforts and those of the staff who taught and cared for them should not be understated. I want to finish on behalf of DFE with a tribute to children and young people themselves. We've all read the Children and Young People's Voices report and the Every Story Matters, and we've heard and seen and been struck by the video shown this morning. We know that this generation were much less likely than adults to suffer the worst health consequences of COVID-19, although we recognise, of course, that some did and some are still living with those consequences. But in general, in this pandemic, children and young people did give up their freedom and suffered from a reduction in services that are crucial to their development and in some cases their safety, in order largely to protect others from harm. The DfE is committed to working with the inquiry and other core participants to ensure that the extent of that sacrifice is recognised and that decisions in future are taken on the basis of the best possible evidence and a full understanding of all the many ways in which children and young people can be uniquely impacted by measures that are necessary to contain a pandemic. My lady, unless I can assist you further.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Ms Ward. That completes the submissions that we have for today. I'm very grateful to everyone who's made oral submissions today and those who've submitted written submissions. I found them all extremely constructive, focused and helpful. So again, thank you very much indeed. I shall return to start the evidence at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.